Good morning, folks. Can everybody hear me? Get a thumbs up. All right. Well, good morning. Welcome. We wanted to start off or kick off this meeting for the Climate Task Force for the Mining and Oil and Gas. I'm here with Brent Campbell at DNR. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie to call roll, please.
All right. Jason Lanklos.
Present.
Brent Campbell.
Here.
Adam Feltz. Al Collins. Andy Jacoby.
Here.
Brian Johnston. Donaldson Caffrey.
Here.
Dr. Richard Hughes.
Here.
Glenn Lyons. I think you're on mute, Mr. Lyons, but I see you there. John Sparling.
Here.
Christy Trail.
Here.
Lori LeBlanc.
I'm here, thank you.
Mark Gebbia.
I'm here.
Selby Bush.
Good morning, I'm here.
Stacy Methvin. Tom Broom.
Present.
William Daniel. And Wynn Radford. All right, I believe we have a quorum.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So appreciate you doing that. And I think we'll just kick it off. Brent and I will kick it off. I just wanted to kind of give some background and context as to what we're going to be doing today and why this is exciting. So for our second meeting, I think that we started off in December and Lindsay and Goka and Harry and staff did a great job of just kind of talking about our charge as a committee in terms of what we would be doing, what the overall goals and objectives are for the committee. Obviously, our main charge is to look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, looking at all available technologies. And this particular committee, I think, has a unique opportunity with our connection to industry and to all of our organizations to work through a lot of those different things. So I think what we're going to see today is really where we're going to collaborate. We're going to ask for significant input from panelists, from such as yourselves, everybody who's on. So, I mean, I think that's really where the difference is. Whereas, we talked about structure, we talked about decision-making and some of the other things, but today is more about communication and collaboration. So I think for us, Brent and I have collaborated on a couple of things, and I think that we have a great structure on some things that we put together already that we're going to go through today. But I really want to encourage folks, and it's one of those things where some meetings are very easy to do on Zoom. Some are easier to do if you were sitting with each other. This would probably be a great meeting to have with a table, but unfortunately, the table we have is here, and it's great to see all of you. So I mean, again, whatever you can do to over communicate and to let us know your thoughts, we greatly appreciate that, because that's really where the success of this committee is going to come from. It's from your input, and we're looking forward to each of your inputs and opinions as to how to make this work, in addition to public input. So for us, with that, I'll kick it over to Brent, and just want to welcome all of you again, and look forward to working through these things today.
Good morning. I'll just keep it real brief. I'd just like to thank everybody for participating and taking the time out of their busy schedules to help us today. I think we can make some big strides today in identifying specific actions that will get us to our goals of greenhouse gas emissions. So I just want to thank everybody for their participation.
Great. All right, Brent, you want to go ahead and do the minutes?
Yeah, if we want to approve the minutes from our last meeting.
You probably need to make a motion.
Oh, yeah. Did somebody make a motion? I'm sorry.
Yes, motion made to approve the minutes from our last meeting.
All right.
I'll second that.
Yeah.
Second.
Thank you, Mark. All right. All right, Lindsay, I think, and Stephanie, I think our meeting minutes have been approved, and thank you so much for just putting those together. I think it was a great recap of what we covered last time. So With that, I'm going to kick it over to Lindsay to kind of to set the stage for the meeting today. We've got a fairly packed agenda and a lot of homework to do. So looking forward to kicking this off. Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you to both of our chairs for those great opening remarks. And I'll just spend a few minutes at the beginning of this meeting in laying out some desired outcomes for the meeting, and then also just talking through some great questions that we've received around the action development process over the past month. So just to answer some questions you guys have, and then Harry will take it forward and work with our chairs and lead you through a few working sessions around developing strategies and actions for this meeting. So as you can tell from here, we have about three sections that we'll divide this meeting into. So first we want to walk away with developing a draft list of sector-related strategies. We'll spend about 20 minutes doing this. This is something that our planning team has put together in coordination with your chairs. Just a big overview of what some strategies are for emission reduction in this sector. But then we'll spend the majority of this meeting brainstorming potential actions within those overarching strategies and assigning a point person to lead development of each proposal. And then lastly, I'll come back at the end and just get some input from you all on what would be a helpful focus for our April cross-sector workshop. So in February, we brought everyone together in one big meeting, one big all-hands meeting, but want to break that into workshops as we go into April to really mix up all of the groups in that time. So throughout this meeting, I'll start with the presentation on process at the beginning and then close us out at the end. Harry and the chairs will lead you through the working sessions. And then Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute will be sharing her screen and live note-taking in our second working session. So with that, I just wanted to go over a few of those questions that we received since Colleen and I led you all through the action development process overview in the February all-hands meeting. So we've received some great questions from you all and from the public as well on the process of submitting actions, including the role of committees and action submittal. What happens once an action is submitted? How are proposed actions evaluated and weighed? Can we collaborate with other members? And then how are public submittals incorporated into the process? So just wanted to take a few minutes and dive into these questions before we get into those working sessions. So to kick us off, here are the next few meetings for you all over the next months. In this March meeting today, we're going to be brainstorming those strategies and actions, as I mentioned. And then our goal is to identify a potential suite of actions and assign you all to draft those actions in our template. In April, as I mentioned, we'll switch all of the groups up in some working sessions, kind of similar to what we have today, some working sessions to provide the opportunity to get feedback from other groups on actions and utilize those cross-disciplinary lenses. And so our goal will then be to refine some select action proposals with feedback from those groups before that April 30th deadline of submitting actions for both the public and the committee members. And then in May, you all will come back together as a committee to discuss the action proposals that you submitted, as well as the ones submitted by the public relevant to this committee. So the goal then will be to identify gaps and then highlight different approaches and begin to put together what these strategy portfolios look like for this committee. So that's just a layout of what you all will be doing over the next few months. And with that, we realize that this is a heavy lift from March through May, especially for the committees, and it might require a lot of collaboration and outside work outside of the meeting times so that you are able to develop the proposals. But after this May timeline, you all won't have too much of a lift as we move into the second half of the year. So focusing the attention and the work of you all in this first half of the year in the development of actions. And then in the second half, we'll keep you apprised of what is happening, and then bring you all back together in August to refine actions and strategies. But I just wanted to reiterate that we went over this slide in the February all-hands meeting, but just wanted to reiterate the direction and purpose of the group. So the role of the sector committees is really in developing the details of actions and how they support the overarching strategies. So proposals that are tasked out in today's meeting won't speak on behalf of the committee or won't automatically be incorporated into the action plan next February. but you all will be submitting as members of the public when you submit your action templates. So this is more of an opportunity to bring together experts in the field to ensure effective actions are developed in this sector. And so with that, I wanted to review what happens when proposals are submitted. I thought this was a great question. As Colleen and I were fleshing this out, realized there are a lot of steps that we wanted you all to be aware of will happen. So after actions are submitted, we're planning to provide regular updates to the climate website and to all of our members as well on proposals as we receive them. So this might look like a biweekly email update, a biweekly update to the website, so that people are aware that their proposals are being received and that they're being cataloged as well. And then once we close that April 30th deadline, proposals will be sorted into their sectors and themes. And that's what you guys will discuss in your May meeting, how to sort and divide those proposals that have been received. Also in May, later in that month, we'll report out to the task force on all of the proposals that have been received, just so they're aware of all of the actions and are able to have visibility on those raw form of proposals as we receive them. And then we'll go through a process as a planning team to organize all the actions across their strategies and sectors. And this may include combining and splitting actions. We know that we'll have to gap fill some and group strategies. We want to create that cohesive portfolio and the cohesive organization of these actions and strategies, knowing that there's a lot of discussion that needs to go on between sectors and between different action proposals. So don't want them to operate in silos. And after that piece, our planning team will then organize actions and strategies into their hypothetical portfolios. And we'll show our work to the task force and to the public as we do these two steps throughout the summer. And then as we move into August, portfolios will be evaluated against our fundamental objectives by the advisory groups and through assessment with other research and other resources that we have as well. And then you all, as I mentioned, will have the opportunity to revise actions based on advisory group feedback as we get into the late summer. And that will lead us into a trade-off analysis with the task force input. So this is where the task force begins to make decisions and begins to understand the trade-offs that exist among different actions and strategies. And then finally, as we get to that February deadline in 2022, this is when the task force will make decisions on the final portfolio and publish that final report. So I know it's a lot of different steps, but as we move throughout this process, I think those later steps will become more apparent, but wanted you all to be aware of where your action will go after it's submitted. And another great question that we've received is on whether a series of related policies or tactics should be submitted as one action or multiple actions. So actions, since they are directly implementable, it's helpful to look at the implementation pathways to see if they're significantly similar or different. So as a reminder on the template, we specify these pathway details as the time frame, who will lead the action, adoption and implementation, who are the partners that need to be at the table, what is the process, again, for adopting and implementing the action, and then what funding mechanisms exist, what funding will it need to be implemented. So if you're looking at these pathways and you see that they're kind of the same, then you might be able to consider submitting one proposed program with some multiple tactics inside of it. But if they need different pathways to implement them, then you should submit as a separate action proposal for each. That's kind of our rule of thumb in deciding if it's one or multiple actions. But with that, I would say this is not a big concern for our discussion today. We really want to focus on generating ideas and being able to get everything out there as we move throughout this process. If you have more questions on this, please just let myself and Colleen know, and we can walk you through what might be one or multiple actions. The last thing that I'll touch on is on collaboration. So we very much encourage collaboration on proposals where multiple groups might be considering common approaches or similar actions. And so the extent to which you can agree on a unified implementation pathway, we encourage you to organize around these action ideas. So sector committee members can work with local organizations. Possibly you might know of a local organization that's more expert at developing an action proposal than you all, or it might be wise to partner with a few organizations around development. Or we know there are some cross-sector strategies and actions as well. So partnering with a member or two members from different sector committees so we can have that cross-collaborative lens. Or multiple members of the public can work together as well. Since these are all public meetings, we want to create the space where they can also propose different approaches or propose different action ideas altogether. But I would say, if members can't agree on an approach, or you think maybe a few different approaches need to be considered in this initial phase, then that's quite all right. We'll sort that out in the trade-off analysis later in the year when we evaluate against our fundamental objectives. So that allows us to consider a broad range of ideas against our outcomes, since we are evaluating against our fundamental objectives. And just a few more notes on this. Several proposals submitted for the same action won't automatically score higher. But we wanted to remove the bias of any popularity of proposals. So by this, I mean that we won't prioritize actions that have multiple.
I'll be the point of contact for that. I'm an attorney.
Donaldson, I think you're off mute, if you don't mind muting.
I can send you their.
There we go. So as I mentioned, we're trying to remove the bias against popularity of proposals. And so don't want to prioritize actions that have multiple submissions or have submission by a committee member instead of by the public. So all of our actions will be evaluated against our objectives to try and remove that bias. But with that, I would say that it's great to have co-developers in an action proposal, and that's a great way to show broad support and organized input as you're developing actions. So with that, I'll take any questions you guys have further on actions. And as I mentioned, as you go throughout this process, please do let me know if you have any thoughts or additional questions on just what development looks like in our template. Okay, great. And I'll pass it over to Harry now to talk through the working sessions. Harry, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you. No, we can't.
Can you hear me now? Hey, how about that? Sometimes you just got to restart it. Well, I guess you didn't hear anything. Good morning, everybody. I'll start from the top. Good morning, everybody. Very excited to kick off these next two working sessions. This really marks the beginning of us diving into the substance. So without any further ado, would you mind going to the next slide? Kind of go over the high-level desired outcomes from this first working session, which is going to be focused on strategies. So our goal is to develop a draft list of sector-related strategies, which we can think of. So the staff and planning team has put together a starting menu of potential strategies based on the means objectives that were discussed in the first committee meeting, some desktop literature review, and best practices. I want to note that strategies, we can add, we can modify, we can delete as this group thinks is necessary. And today we're really focused on brainstorming, thinking broadly, and idea generation. We also want to discuss how these broad strategies apply to Louisiana, and that can help shape, how we are thinking about these strategies. And then eventually what actions will populate. And then we also want to present overarching strategies that apply across sectors, and so that's covered in the coming slides. I also want to just emphasize, I think Lindsay covered it well, but just a reminder, a strategy is a high-level path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the action is how to achieve that strategy. Next slide. Ground rules for discussion. As I mentioned, there's no bad ideas. We are trying to throw everything against the wall, and as we further develop these ideas and identify the consequences, that's where we'll see what sticks. And please make sure, I want to hear from all of you, but please make sure we share the floor and are respectful of other people, and let's not talk over each other. Next slide. So this is the starting menu, so to speak, that the staff put together. And I'll just run through them and then run through the intersectional strategies and then overarching themes. And then we'll come back to this slide and we can discuss what modifications we need to make. So just generally thinking about, breaking it down into two categories of upstream and midstream. From our last meeting, we discussed sort of the refining. The downstream component would fit well within manufacturing and industry, although as we'll hit in the next slide, that is certainly an intersectional component that we want to make sure we're breaking down the silos and that the committees are speaking with one another. But under upstream and midstream, increased monitoring of emissions and reducing leaks are some common strategies for upstream, reducing flaring and venting, strategically managing demand and transition, increasing carbon capture, use and storage, as well as increasing natural sequestration on lease areas are potential strategies that we can start thinking of and that would apply to this sector. For midstream, using renewable energy to operate pipelines and storage facilities to further reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of operations, reducing the footprint of other modes of transportation. So, rail or by truck or some other means of transporting oil and gas, and then managing rights of way for transportation of additional materials like CO2 or hydrogen, or some general strategies that we can use as just helpful heuristics to think through what specific policies we would want to put forward. Next slide. Then there's some cross-cutting strategies with other sectors. So carbon capture as well as hydrogen are certainly those two areas have been discussed by Power Production, Distribution and Use Committee, as well as manufacturing and industry. Manufacturing industry that also had a discussion of strategies that include increasing the recycling of feedstock and reducing overapplication of or waste of bulk chemicals, overlapping with agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste, methane recapture and power generation, biofuels and chemicals, and then managing of lease areas as carbon sinks. And then again, with transportation mentioned on the last slide, thinking about supply chain, transportation of oil and gas and other mining materials. It's just important to recognize that there's some intersectionality with the transportation network. Next slide. And then general kind of non-sector strategies and themes include economy-wide mechanisms. We certainly want to include climate equity as we are thinking through strategies and specific actions as we're developing policies or programs to make sure we're infusing equity into that construct. Economic transition, engagement and education of the public and stakeholders, research and development, and financing strategies are some things that we want to make sure that are on top of mind for everybody as we're thinking through specific strategies and actions. And so I guess let's move back a few slides, and I want to kind of start the conversation with respect to these sector-specific strategies, and I'll kick it over to our chairs to open it up to whether they have any initial thoughts, or would like to open it up to the group?
Sure, Harry, thanks so
Harry,
much.
before you do that,
Yeah.
could you
Hey, Tom, go ahead.
define strategically manage demand and transition, please?
Would you like me to go into strategically managing demand and transition? Well, I think it's just recognizing that oil and gas are commodities, and demand is an important component, and thinking through what does future demand look like, recognizing that there's a move, certainly for transportation to electric vehicles. What does that do for demand? So I think thinking strategically about that is important for this committee. But I certainly just put it on there and welcome your thoughts on what that means to you, or whether that is relevant.
Well, thanks for that. And I think I jumped out of order. Apologies. Let's hear from our chairs first, and then I'll maybe jump back in.
Tom, we will definitely be asking for you to jump back in, I can promise you. And I think that our thoughts are pretty in line with what's been presented. And I'll just throw a couple of things out there that look at and really implement some of these strategies, just for example. So there are companies who are looking at taking greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, and actually making it into products. And there are actually a couple of successful projects that are taking CO2 and using it in the beverage industry. We actually have a company called LanzaTech out of Chicago that developed a protein, or a synthetic protein, that they materialize from rabbits and other animals, that breaks down CO2 and can actually be an additive in jet fuel, or actually produce a green jet fuel. So things like that, and innovative ways that we can look or bring industry into Louisiana that is looking at this in terms of CO2 management, in terms of what do we do with all these industrial emissions, with the greenhouse gases, with methane, and what are the strategies or some of the practical things that we can do to reduce them. That can be done through, it's more or less, these types of things where we actually just reduce the emissions, or are there other things and other ways that we can do to monitor them and actually turn them into products? Or are there environmental controls or other things that we can do on the CO2 emissions from the start? So I think that this is more or less looking at this in terms of a pathway, in terms of what industries have potential, very, very pure stream CO2 that we can go after very quickly. And then how do we get that middle ground of industries that have a lot of high output of greenhouse gas emissions, and start to work with them to develop some strategies to make sure that we're looking at everything holistically. So I'll stop there, but I think that this is really where we're counting on just the depth and breadth of the panelists to provide that input to us, so we can start to develop these high list strategies. Brent, anything further?
No, I'd just like to open it up to the group and see what input we have.
All right. So Tom, you want to kick us off with just some initial thoughts, and I think Harry, if it's okay, just maybe we could run through initial thoughts or reactions from Tom, and then maybe kick it over to some of the other panelists to kind of go through that as well.
Well, thank you, Jason, and I guess I did put myself on the spot here to make the initial comment. So I love what you've done. I almost feel like we've been given a textbook with the answers in the back. Now we have to work our way to the back of the book, but I think we know what the answers are. So I think that what I and other members in our group can do is bring our personal experiences to modify these. But the list of both upstream and midstream items are acceptable to me, as to the extent that I understand what they mean, which is why I was asking the managing demand, which is an awfully difficult thing to do. But so my initial thought is, if I think about the impact, much of it comes from the piece that we're not doing downstream. The refineries, the chemical plants, things of that nature, and how can we help them, given these two columns in our menu? It would be carbon capture, use, and storage. And I know we have some of literally some world experts on that topic on our committee, so we're well positioned to do that. My again, what could I bring to the table? I think about transition. I mean, we're not going to get to zero greenhouse gas emissions in the near term as a state or as a nation or as a world. And I think about how do we begin moving in that direction given the realities of today. And to me, natural gas is a big part of that answer. And I know our focus is on Louisiana, as it should be, but I think we also need to allow ourselves to think nationally and internationally. And Louisiana has an abundance of natural gas, onshore, coastal, and offshore. And my initial thought would be increasing production of natural gas using the items in this menu to the best possible ability as a bridge fuel to get us to some of the things that will eventually be coming on between now and 2050. So I'm not sure that, Harry, you would be fired if we added increased natural gas production to our upstream list, or increased natural gas production using best possible environmental methods. But that's something that I think our state is uniquely positioned to do for the benefit of the rest of the nation and the world. So that's other than, let me emphasize, a congratulations to all of you who put this starting menu together, and a definite a desire to do a very, very deep dive in the CCUS, but also consider what Louisiana can do for ourselves and for our nation and for the world by bringing more of this bridge fuel to market in the most environmentally sensitive means possible. You know, the number that I keep in mind is that natural gas has between 50 and 60% less CO2 emissions than oil or coal. And you know, there's going to be a lot of talk about electricity and how is that electricity generated. Eventually, it may be all wind, solar, wave, some other method, but for now and for the short term, a lot of it's going to come from natural gas. So that would be three initial thoughts for me, Jason, to pass on to others and keep the conversation going.
Tom, thanks so much for those thoughts, and just a couple things I'd like to comment on, and I think that as we go forward in looking at that lens of energy transition in Louisiana and reducing carbon emissions, I think we're going to find, and we do a lot of work with other states, and I think what they found as well is that in other countries, you know, the UK. We've done a lot of interplay with the United Kingdom and looked at what they're doing with industry and Rotterdam and some of these other ports. And what they're finding is, I think, what we're going to find. And that's you have some very low-hanging fruit where you have industries and you have processes that can capture and reduce emissions in a fairly straightforward process. The reality is that there's going to be a middle ground of industries and of chemical refiners and others that are going to be a little bit more difficult, that take that longer transition time to work towards that renewable platform. So I think it's collaborating and working together to develop a strategy that makes sense for all these industries to look at. And I think that that's where expertise is going to play in, where we need to work together to look at any and all available technologies and to look at what makes sense for Louisiana in order to meet those goals. And I think that that's what's so special about this committee, is that we have the tools and the resources to start to put that framework together. So I appreciate your thoughts, and you know, I'd love to hear from some of our other panelists as well. Who would Brent has volunteered to call on folks if we need to, so I'm gonna just tee it up to say that we'll offer up thoughts there, and hope someone else chimes in. Otherwise, we'll ask specifics.
And Jason, can I hop in just to
Yes,
clarify
please.
a point? Tom, thank you for your thoughts, and I do want to clarify that while our focus is certainly on what the state can do, we recognize that this is a global effort, and so we want to be cognizant of policies, you know, eventually developing potential policies or programs that, you know, may be more appropriate for, you know, a regional approach or a national approach or international approach. And so that is there's opportunity to make that delineation in the action proposal template. And so we recognize that certain things might not be within the state's purview, but it might be a larger effort or more appropriate for a larger effort. And so those ideas are welcome and appreciated.
Thank you, Harry. And before, again, I'd just like to reiterate that this particular session, obviously, we're going to have another session after this that's going to take a deeper dive into individual specifics on developing those strategies, but really would like to hear from some of the other folks on our panel on just initial thoughts on is there something missing, or are there things that we need to add? Big picture takes on this would be much appreciated.
Hey, Harry, I was going to chime in. This is Mark Jebbia. Tom, I think that was a great point, and I'd probably even take your statement in a slightly different direction and just say, really the element of the menu might be reducing the carbon intensity of Louisiana natural gas. I think there's a lot of elements to that. I mean, the increased monitoring is a key part of that. It might add increased monitoring and quantification. Just from the general debates on, what is the methane leakage from wellhead to burner tip or LNG facility. And, with that brings in things like, incorporating renewable natural gas, or might be, methanated hydrogen. So green hydrogen that you can then convert to methane and deliver to the same end use points that natural gas is currently going to. And I think the advantage of really focusing on the carbon intensity is the global competitiveness of Louisiana produced natural gas, and that's should be a pretty important factor in this. We're seeing it both in from the LNG side of a desire to improve lower intensity of natural gas, and even seeing it in some domestic demand points where an actual customer of ours up in the Pacific Northwest is requiring their gas to be sourced from Canada because they determined that the Canadian gas was lower intense than gas produced in the Rocky Mountains. So I think that's an interesting area to go to, because I think we'd all agree that in any supply stack, no matter what future 1.5 degree, 2 degree scenarios, there's a pretty good piece of that stack is produced from natural gas. And the only other thing I would add is kind of seeing this more in the Northeast, but probably a concern in Louisiana would be the Orphan Wells and potential methane leakage from that. I think that we might want to think about a component in the upstream side on addressing Orphan Wells.
Mark, really appreciate those thoughts. And one of the things that we've had in some of our internal discussions as well is talking about exactly what you just talked about. It is lower carbon intensity products. Is there a market for that in Louisiana? How can we position ourselves? There's a steel mill in the Middle East that's producing a low carbon intensity steel that they're marketing all over the world, that's being spec'd into certain products. Obviously, the California low carbon fuel standard is something that we're tracking. That standard is driving a lot of investment decisions to look at reducing carbon intensity in products and actually looking at greener intensity products. So I think that for us, that's a big thing. And I think it's also a big opportunity for Louisiana to look at those things in industry and how we can incorporate some of their strategies. So really appreciate those thoughts and look forward to talking some more about it.
Jason, I'll jump in so you don't have to call on people. I would like to reiterate Tom's idea about the strategically managed demand and transition. With the Princeton study, I even had this question of what are the boundary conditions? If we're presuming that the products made in Louisiana are not going to be continued to be used, I think we're fooling ourselves. And so that one really, to me, needs to be defined because it's hard for us to solve a problem when we don't know the boundary conditions. That's an engineer talking, but sorry, that's what I am. The other thing is the idea of low-hanging fruit. my passion is lately has been sequestration, and the discussion during the Princeton talk, as well as others, seems to be this idea that sequestration is a bad word or something. And I don't know how we change public perception on that, but we've got a lot of opportunities in the shallow offshore. If we want to, we would have some ideas of how to do that naturally. We might even think about how we could use sort of wetlands as a sequestration site, and have some reclamation being done at the same time, because the site would then be, in theory, off limits to others being able to go ahead and penetrate that area. I think there are some really interesting ideas in that space, but it's hard to sort of chime in on some of that when the passion against seems very, very strong. And I would ask the question to Harry. Has Sam Bentley contacted you? LSU has this fairly wide-ranging set of ideas of how to do sequestration in a variety of different ways, and we were in the same boat. We weren't understanding how do we sort of put that into the process here individually or as a group, and I think he was going to reach out and talk to you about that.
Okay, I have not received his email, but I will make sure that we get in touch. And development of these actions of using your example of carbon capture through the action templates, it would be ideal, and we'll get to that in the next working session in just a few minutes, and we can assign out homework, or that is the plan, and we can have leads to develop those ideas and either work collaboratively or at least coordinate. And it may be one submission, it may be multiple, because there are different ways to do it.
Okay, I'll ping Sam also and just remind him that he needs to contact you.
I appreciate that. And thank you, Dr. Hughes. And as the author of Strategically Managed Demand and Transition, I think, I certainly welcome ideas on how to reword that or reframe it. I think there's two concepts that I was trying to put into one bullet. I think there's the notion of, carbon management, transitioning from an oil and gas company to a carbon management company or an energy company is a concept that I was trying to capture there in that transition. As Tom mentioned, transitioning to, and I believe Mark also mentioned, transitioning to lower carbon intensity products and fuels is another component. So managing. And so, and then forecasting, what does demand look like in 2050? And is it impacted by, or how can Louisiana best position itself to continue to play a role in, the ongoing, whatever the ongoing oil and gas markets look like, right? How do we make ourselves most attractive in a global marketplace, right? That is trying to also be net zero by 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So open to how we can reword that, or we can the planning team is certainly taking notes on everyone's comments, and we can rework it after the meeting if there are no ideas at the top of anyone's mind.
Harry, I think, and I appreciate your comments, Dr. Hughes, and I think that basically there has to be something in there where we start to identify technologies that help us get to net zero by 2050, right? And I think that, when we talk about that all hands on deck mentality, the technology, some are more vetted than others, some are newer, some are expensive, obviously, but I think that when we look at all hands on deck, there will be technologies that emerge to say that in order to meet these goals and to meet, net zero, we're going to have to deploy X amount of these types of projects. We're going to have to do carbon capture on this type of industry. So I think that just looking at those holistically, where we say, these technologies right now are the most promising. Obviously, leave the door open for any others, but I think it's just, trying to see what's plausible now that we can identify to help us get to those goals. All right, Lindsay, do we have a few more minutes? Yes.
Yeah, this is Adam Feltz from the Environmental Defense Fund.
Hey,
First, hello. First, I wanted to thank all the panelists who have spoken so far with their good ideas. And I just wanted to throw on the table what EDF has been thinking for this committee. So nothing extremely novel, but here's our take. So first on methane emissions, that's been a key aspect of EDF's advocacy around the country for the last 10 years, because reducing methane emissions from the upstream sector in particular is so impactful to overall short-term emissions and can generally be accomplished less expensively than many other climate mitigation avenues. So that is a low-hanging fruit. And policies like quarterly leak detection and repair, I would say is, if you just do that, you've done a whole lot. And there's a bunch of states that have recently adopted that standard, and it seems to be working out okay. And we have a few other ideas along those lines, and I'm happy to lead an action template on that front. We have around 50 people who are working full-time on reducing methane emissions from upstream at EDF, and so we definitely have capacity to help tailor that for Louisiana. So that's one area. The second area on carbon capture and sequestration. So we have a lot of ideas for how to ensure that CCS has environmental integrity, which is to say no CO2 leaks, no groundwater contamination, and no significant earthquakes. And in fact, the seismicity issue is one in particular that I think is worth pursuing here, because while the Class 6 program does a pretty good job on the CO2 leakage and the groundwater contamination, that rule was developed before people knew as much as they do about induced seismicity. And so there's room for some backfilling there. There's also room for ensuring regulatory capacity that LDNR and other agencies that are tasked with overseeing CCS have all the resources that they need, and that their staff are properly trained to ensure efficient and effective permitting and a handful of other things along those lines. But I will sound a note of caution, and it has to do with the intersection of CCS and equity. And so many in the environmental justice community, which I cannot speak for, but I can pass along what I have been hearing, are concerned about CCS and its many permutations. And of course, there are many permutations. And so that sort of takes the line, goes along the lines of for facilities that would be getting capture equipment, there's concern that those facilities would be enlarged, that much more power would be consumed to run the equipment, and that the impacts, whether through air toxics or otherwise, to the fence line communities would get worse and not better. That's one concern. The second concern is more pipelines going here and there. And then the third concern is about the injection sites themselves and whether there are these risks of CO2 leakage, groundwater contamination, earthquakes, et cetera. And then the laminated on top of that is overall mistrust of the industry and the regulators on this question, and an additional overall concern that CCS is a modality to extend the fossil fuel economy and in fact give it a green halo, that allows it to continue forward while ultimately still causing climate pollution, and in particular causing traditional pollution. I'm just putting all that out there because those are real concerns that a lot of people have, and that action on CCS in Louisiana needs to grapple with all of that in a real way. That's some heavy stuff, but it's got to be on the table. And now the third thing, and I probably should have stopped with that one because that's a lot, but the third thing is Orphan Wells, and I appreciate that it's been brought up. We've been working a lot, EDF has been working a lot on Orphan Wells in the past year. We're pursuing federal legislation that would provide stimulus dollars towards the plugging of Orphan Wells all over the country. If that goes through, and there's a pretty good chance that it will, then the DNR will be flooded with cash that it needs to hand out to plugging contractors to do the work. And so getting DNR ready for that possibility, which is I think more of a probability, would stand the state in good stead. And then the tougher part is, how do you reduce future orphan well burden? And that's a function of modifying bonding, financial assurance type rules, and how idle wells are managed, and various circumstances along well transfer and the like. So that's a bigger project, but is a worthwhile one for climate, water quality, and other reasons. Okay, that's my spiel.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate that, and we'll certainly get into more of that as we get into the next working session on action development. But I do see 3 hands raised, and want to make sure that we get to them before moving into the next working group. So let's go, Christy, then Stacy, then Lori.
All right, great. Thank you, Harry. So yes, I do want to reiterate what Mark and Adam talked about with Orphan Wells. And I think I would classify it more as legacy infrastructure. So really addressing more than just the leaks from an abandoned wellhead, but to ensure that that actual hardware is removed. And we see that with flow lines and pipelines and even platforms just cause hazards to navigation, and just slow leaks. Maybe it's methane, maybe it's oil or condensate. So I think all of that just has a effect on the environment as a whole. And then I wanted to focus a little bit more on the natural sequestration. So Jason, can you just tell me a little bit more about that focus? Because I know, Adam, you were talking a lot about carbon capture and the injection well, but I am curious more about the natural sequestration.
So Harry, you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So I was just thinking about it, and maybe this is not, this is a question of, is this the landowner responsibility? Is there opportunity in existing leases to further natural sequestration on areas that aren't, the active work site for EMP? And so, that was just an idea. I think you're certainly onto some, the inner, the co-location of exploration and production in wetlands, for example, or in other forested areas for onshore, and just understanding what are opportunities to increase the natural sequestration. And so we can flesh out what that looks like in our next planning session. But do you have any? Do you think that kind of frames correctly of just trying to increase as to the extent possible and allowable under a lease, or to maximize between allow the landowner to have clarity of what the lease would allow them to continue to do on site to increase sequestration, should they be interested in pursuing that?
Yeah, I think as you've stated, that bullet point captures it correctly. And I guess just what I was curious to hear is if you had a preset notion of what that meant, or if it was really more around exploring opportunities. So I think I heard more around exploring and trying to understand what it means and if there's a benefit there. So I'm good with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think exploring, I mean, from a coastal perspective, to the extent you maintain or even restore wetlands, you also are, sequestering carbon. So, I mean, there's benefit to the extent, any legacy infrastructure can benefit the landscape. You actually have a net benefit there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Christy. And then let's go Stacy, then Lori, then Al.
Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to say that unfortunately I had to join late. So if I am repeating things, just see it as a reinforcement, not just repetition. But so just a few areas that I don't see on upstream that we're working hard on in the West Texas area that might be applicable is first electrification of the rig fleet, the rigs and the frac fleets. Also just electrification of any aspect of our E&P business that we can, because I do think that you either can use local natural gas to electrify, or you can, if you have access to the power grid, you can connect to the grid. And if you focus the generation of electricity back at a central large place, then I think using carbon capture and sequestration is much more efficient. And I think just in general is emission management at a critical, in a critical mass at a particular location is better than in lots of diverse areas. So electrification is a big one that I'd like to see on the list. There was a comment around induced seismicity, which got me thinking about water management. And I think water management is a really big deal, particularly in areas where we're fracking. Use of fresh water, injection of produced water, just overall recycling of water as best we can. So that's an area that I think just shows that we are sort of earning the right to be present and a part of the future energy usage. And as everybody's talked about, there's not going to be one single solution here. So there's going to be multiple sources of energy that's going to be needed in many different forms, depending where you are in the future. And so that all leads to my final comment, which is around ESG, which is obviously very prevalent in everybody's thinking these days. And to me, for the upstream, it's really the right to be in business, and that we have to look at ESG and how each of our companies are performing. And so perhaps Louisiana we can make some suggestions about what are the right ratings to be looking at to kind of set a high bar on the performance of companies in our state in the ESG areas. And I think that will continue to raise the performance of everyone and give us a common language to talk about it in. So just a few of my comments to add to the list. Thanks.
Thank you, Stacy. Let's go Lori, Al, then Glenn.
Hey, good morning, Harry. Good morning, Jason. This is Lori LeBlanc with Lamoga. Thank you again for being such great stewards and leaders on this initiative. Really appreciate all the work that you all have done. Just a couple of comments. Also wanted to make that comment that I am representing Lamoga, and I know we have representation on other committees. So I'm not going to repeat some of the things that were mentioned, I know, on Friday's committee meeting. So I don't want to really duplicate that, since it's more of those were sort of downstream comments and suggestions. The one thing I wanted to bring up today is specific to the sequestration piece of it that's already been discussed, and the opportunities around looking at the state's coastal restoration, coastal master plan, and what those opportunities are there. Not sure what, maybe the Water Institute is already looking at this, but are there ways that maybe we can make some changes to the master plan recommendations to perhaps be to increase the carbon offset potential? There are different ways of doing our restoration projects that could increase that carbon offset. So, and really understanding the value the restoration projects and what that can bring forward to reducing emissions and getting some value out of that and maximizing that value. And like I said, I'm not sure if the Water Institute is already looking at this. I know that they are considered to be, they're in-state, they're world recognized expertise over there. So perhaps there's more we can do in that space.
Thank you, Lori. And yes, the Water Institute through the Restore Act is doing some work to quantify the sequestration value of the coastal master plan and all of its projects, and looking at the future without the master plan and the future with, and really capturing and quantifying. So that work is just beginning, and so we'll have more end of this year, early next year on that point. But great point. Al, and then Glenn, and then I think we'll try and move on to the next planning session. So Al, if you, I don't know.
I'm trying to unmute myself. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm going to be real quick. I want to get back to, I think, Dr. Hughes's point earlier that mentioned the importance of continuing to produce. He mentioned natural gas as a transition fuel. I think that is an important concept. I do think we ought to tie it to lower carbon intensity, not only natural gas, but oil too, with an eye towards net zero barrels of oil, net zero natural gas. And that can be accomplished by the last bullet, which is, well, I guess a combination of the bullets. Certainly addressing methane, that's one of the quickest ways to lower the intensity of the produced product. And then using offsets, be it natural as the last bullet, or CCUS to reduce the carbon impact of the rest of the production of that fossil. So that ties everything, I think, back to net zero, and it gets us away from saying, one particular, if we're judging everything by the same yardstick, which is net zero, then it gives all these products a place in the future, and it uses the same way of judging them. I also want to mention induced seismicity too. I think that goes hand in hand with the produced water. The way Texas has looked at resolving this is with TexNet, and what I've learned is that this is an issue bigger than one operator. It takes a lot of different operators working together and having the academic community help us too. And I think TexNet's been a successful approach, and we've been advocating for California to look at that approach to induce seismicity too, where that, of course, is a huge concern. And lastly, Adam mentioned EJ, a very important point. I think one that we need to learn a lot more about, but what I'm learning is that there are co-benefits around the various technologies that address the more traditional pollutants like NOx and SOx, and when you link those with carbon capture, because you have to clean up the emissions to a really higher level, and in some cases you can actually generate credits under the NACS program that are fungible and help operations in non-attainment areas. So that this, I know that's getting probably way more complex than we want to get, but the only point is some things have multiple benefits, so we should always make sure we're looking at and we're accounting for all the benefits of the technologies that we're looking at.
Yes, definitely. I know that's a great point, and that is something that we'll be working on, and the advisory groups will provide their input on impacts, and try to capture and frame these and structure these policies, programs to maximize benefits and co-benefits and minimize any harms or costs. And so let's go to, I know Glenn you had a comment, and then we'll move on to our next planning session.
Yeah, first of all, let me just check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So a few things. One, I just want to compliment this starting menu. I think it's a very well thought out starting point. I also want to jump on, several people have mentioned the point about, and in fact, on this list, I mean, these are a lot of things that ExxonMobil, we are actively pursuing on our own already. But one key thing I've heard other people say is about intensity. And I want to focus on that for a second, because I don't think anybody's really articulated the importance of that. You know, we're dealing, when we're talking oil and gas nowadays, both of those are basically a global market. And you can reduce emissions within the state of Louisiana and effectively have just exported those emissions elsewhere. And so focusing on intensity is really important aspect here. One other thing I want to throw out, which is I'm hearing a lot of kind of specific project kind of actions, and I haven't heard a lot of discussion about crafting an overall sort of climate policy and how that might be done in Louisiana. And so we have kind of our list of what we think makes up sound climate policy. And I just want to throw those things out to make sure that that one, they've been articulated, and two, they're being considered. So one, I mean, I've already kind of hit on it, the idea of this is a global issue. And so we've got to think globally when we're proposing policy. Market prices are going to be much more effective at, determining what solutions are going to be implemented, who's going to implement them, when they're implemented. I think that's a critical aspect. The cost of emissions is something that, if it's transparent and predictable, it helps industry to plan. Minimizing the complexity, minimizing the administrative costs, both to industry as well as to the state itself, I think is critical. I already hit on transparency. And then I think somebody earlier had mentioned about, you've got to be flexible for future technologies, developments in technologies, and the advancements in just climate science itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent points. And thanks for putting that out there for the group to chew on. At this point, let's move on to our next planning session. And we, just to reiterate, Colleen McHugh with the Water Institute has been taking notes, and so we'll go back and rework a lot of these strategies and framing and incorporate your comments. So they just know that they are not just going out into the ether. We're capturing them, and they'll be reflected moving forward. So next, we're moving into our working session on actions. Very similarly, we're going to brainstorm a list of potential actions. I think we'll try to, just for organizational purposes, try and work through the strategies one by one and populate with actions. But don't feel constrained if I know we identified some additional strategies, and if they're not reflected up there, please don't hesitate to voice your action or your idea. Then once we have a list developed, we'll assign committee members to take lead roles. And I just want to reiterate, you won't be developing these proposals on behalf of the committee. You'll develop them on behalf of yourself or your company and or your organization. And we want to make sure that there's collaboration, that we're duplicate templates aren't being developed. But we encourage collaboration and coordination, but we also recognize that there may be nuances in specific actions, in specific policies or programs that I know Dr. Hughes, you mentioned. I mean, there are many ways, for example, to do carbon capture and sequestration, and they may have different impacts, may have different ways to minimize harms or maximize co-benefits. So to the extent there, a general program can be drilled down into several different action templates. That's great, and we certainly welcome that. And just again to reiterate, an action is based around a specific policy, program, or project that can be directly implemented. And so I believe with this, ground rules, same as before. Y'all did great. Feel free to raise your hand, or if there's dead air, just voice your, feel free to chime in. And so with that, I believe we are gonna go into Colleen's gonna lead a screen sharing, and she's gonna take live notes as ideas are generated.
And I'll say here, I tried to capture, I think at the strategy level in blue, some additional notes from the group here. I also have captured some of the detail. I think some folks are already talking about actions, great action ideas, even in the previous session. So I have some of those notes saved, but I think if we could even reiterate them in this session, that'd be great.
Thank you, Colleen. And so with that, let's dive in. And I know increasing monitoring and I believe somebody, maybe it was Mark, mentioned quantification as well. Let's think, and perhaps it makes sense to think of it comprehensively, both upstream and midstream. Maybe y'all are the experts, so defer to y'all on how to think about it. But what are some specific policies or programs that can really increase monitoring and quantification?
So this is Adam from EDF. So I'll reiterate leak detection and repair, which is kind of the gold standard, at least for upstream. I can't speak as much to midstream, but on the upstream side, the science we've done has found that the bulk of the emissions comes from super emitters. And so the most efficient and effective thing you could do is look at all of the facilities with some frequency so that when you find a super emitter, you can fix it quickly. And that's a program that's been implemented in a bunch of other states.
Well, just to drill down a little further, do you have any specific examples of other what other states have done in order to increase their monitoring efforts?
Yeah, Colorado, New Mexico, Ohio have all adopted quarterly leak detection and repair. I think California too. Pennsylvania is heading in that direction.
Thank you, Adam.
Harry, this is Lori LeBlanc. I have a comment relative to the leak detection.
Sure.
So we would like to also add to that leveraging technology and allow companies to use some more updated technology. I'm hearing there's an optical gas imaging technology that could be used. So looking at, leveraging technology around the LDAR program.
Yeah, flexibility is certainly a plus.
Yeah, I would echo Lori's comment. And also with that, there's, aerial based and satellite based concepts that really get directly at the super emitter concept with more frequency than quarterly.
That's great. So is that, are there, is there a partnership with universities or I guess who's currently leading who's at the cutting edge of developing this technology, and how do we, bring this into the field?
We're using it in West Texas. We're working, I gotta go back and get the company for you, but there's a lot of people that are doing flyovers in that area and starting to be able to see some pretty small emitters.
Yeah, I think the basin-wide work in the Permian is a really good example.
Yeah.
I would say I feel like I've been spending a lot of my time trying to stay on top of this world, and there's a lot of the technology advancements very, very quick right now. A lot of development going on.
Great.
I think people realize, like when I was running a refinery, we had over 350,000 data points or connections, valves, et cetera, that we had to check quarterly. And and it all has to be done manually with sniffers. It's such an inefficient process that I think this is an area where it's been said before, we've got to bring innovation and allow it to get done where it really is going after the problem. And the key is getting it, having a really short time for repair, because that can't linger on.
And for efficiency purposes, I think this discussion can apply to the midstream increase monitoring bullet as well. There are differences, but none that I think would warrant many changes from what we've discussed so far.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom.
Yeah, and the processing plant part of the midstream is exactly what was just mentioned there on the refining piece of the thousands of components that are monitored with sniffers at crazy intervals.
Excellent. And just for clarification, we mentioned the Permian basin-wide work. Is that one, who's leading that work, or are there multiple efforts? Basin-wide indicates to me that it's kind of more comprehensive look as opposed to piecemeal. Is that accurate, or is it?
So this is Adam. I get the sense that there are multiple efforts. So EDF has a big Permian mapping campaign, which I don't know a ton about, but I think that that's not the only one.
Yeah, I think Pioneer's been very progressive on even taking it to the predictive side of anticipating leaks. So yeah, there's a couple there. And I think the major flag here is that somebody made the comment earlier that some of these efforts are best done kind of as we're all in this together perspective. And this would be one of them. Of most of these broad scale monitoring techniques, like the satellite based, it's really effective with, looking at all of the infrastructure at once. So.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
There's a program at EPA, and I don't actually know if it still exists. It's called EPA Natural Gas Star. It's a voluntary program, but it does, it's essentially a best practices sharing forum for operators. And, EPA has some incentives around just awards and recognition for operators that have best practices. So it could just be a place to look at some technologies and maybe even the Permian, kind of who's leading the way there.
It exists. It's a little bit over the, and to throw in with that is performance-based concepts of one future.
Thank you, Christy and Mark. Lori and then Al, are those fresh hands that are raised, or?
No, mine's
Okay.
not.
Floor is yours, Lori.
No, I'm sorry. That's an old hand.
Okay, same with you, Al? I'll take that as possibly yes.
So I'll jump in if everybody's hands are not.
Please.
Would there be a need or a desire for a centralized reporting repository that would be open for neural nets or AIs to work on, to either anticipate or to figure out where the next super emitter is? That's a question, not necessarily a suggestion. We're finding for some of the offshore safety issues that seems to us to be a pretty reasonable way to get it away from the regulatory agencies pointing fingers at a particular difficulty and getting more into, these are some issues where if you check them on a regular basis, you can prevent.
Any thoughts on Dr. Hughes's kind of question, idea of a central repository for reporting or monitoring? Folks can think on that. Anything else in the monitoring or quantification strategy? If not, we can always go back. What about, let's move to reducing flaring and venting of methane in particular. Open up the floor to.
I think there's a lot of policy that needs to be looked at here because, when you get a permit to flare and you're allowed to flare for 30 days after you hook up a well or while you're testing, sometimes those are just extended on and on and on. People have sometimes got into the routine of just flaring because it's very difficult to hook it up, and oil is so much more valuable than gas, so you end up in that situation. So there's just a lot here where if we review, as you note there, the policy, we perhaps can find ways to probably put a bit stricter regulations around it. I know I'm on the board of Pioneer, and we've taken a commitment not to have any routine flaring. Venting is another challenge, but I think a lot of that is working in conjunction with the gas plants, because a lot of times if the gas plant goes down, then it backs up and the pressure increases on your system and you pop your vent. So it's definitely something where you have to work along the value chain to ensure that there's sufficient amount of infrastructure in place, but also that the infrastructure is well maintained and thinking about the impacts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for those comments, Stacy. I mean, are there any? I know y'all operate in Texas. Are there other any states that you think are doing this particularly well in terms of regulating or?
I think the Texas Railroad Commission is really bringing it up higher and higher on its agenda because of the bold statements that some of the independents have been making about trying to shut this down. We know that flaring and venting is probably one of the biggest black marks on our industry, and it's in our best interest to get it fixed. So.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of increasing capacity along the value chain and increasing storage capacity with respect to venting, is that I guess, do you have thoughts on how to effectuate that or to ensure that there is enough storage, so that there is no or less likelihood of needing to vent?
I think the question is a different question, perhaps.
Okay.
Do you allow permitting of wells if it's not tied into a gas plant? Mm-hmm. Permitting a production of wells. And if you do allow that, then you're welcoming flaring. If you don't have proper monitoring of some of these gas plants and they go down a lot, and then they have flaring, and then they have the unintended consequence of backing up with the pressure, I think that's another area where, again, state regs can put some pressure to invest and make sure that the capacity is there.
Thank you for clarifying.
I mean, it used to be, I think a lot of people used to believe that flaring was sort of part of the process versus an emergency use only. I think we have to get it back to it's an emergency use only system, not part of your production process.
Mm-hmm. So maybe there's to some degree an education or kind of culture shift.
It's a cultural change. Yeah. It's expensive. I mean, if you're out in a remote area, tying in your gas line is
mm-hmm.
But that needs to be considered in the economics of the well and from the beginning.
So this is Adam. I'll second everything Stacy said, and I will also add that there's an issue in flaring efficiency, i.e. what percent in the flare of the methane is actually being burned. And New Mexico and Colorado in their recent rulemakings have been addressing flaring efficiency standards, like 98% along those lines.
Great point, Adam. Thank you.
Hey, this is Al Collins. I apologize about leaving up my hand, but as long as it's up, I'm going to jump back in and mention a report that EDF did on West Texas operators and looked at kind of best practices for addressing methane leaks, venting, and flaring. I think there's some good stuff in that report. Oxy participated in it. I thought a lot of the items that were identified were very reasonable. And I agree with everything that Stacy said too, although I'm not an expert as she is in this area. But a lot of companies, including mine, have joined the World Bank pledge to reduce routine flaring by, I think, 2029. These voluntary programs, I think, should be encouraged as more of the bigger operators join them. And I think a lot of shareholders are very interested in making sure that flaring and venting is reduced and minimized and brought back to a real safety issue, as Stacy mentioned. So we're going to be learning a lot. This is, I think, a great area where the industry is going to move forward, and the leaders are going to, or the early movers are going to show how important it is to accomplish it and how to do it. So there's going to be some examples for other operators to follow. And the issue of infrastructure that Stacy mentioned is addressed well in the EDF report too. Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
So one other piece on that for cross collaboration or whatever probably would be, and I don't know about Texas, but here in Louisiana, you probably would have to have something in the legal realm that allows for the remote wells to essentially have their lease held for, if you're not going to allow the flaring and the connection to a gas line is the difficulty, then one simple, not about simple, it's one way to switch that around is for the lease to be held, as long as that's the issue and that you are working on it.
Yeah, thank you for drilling down on a specific policy. Any other thoughts on reducing flaring and venting, recognizing there are two issues addressed separately?
Harry, this is Glenn. I just wanted to make sure that I highlight for everybody. I put it in the chat box that ExxonMobil has a methane regulatory framework that we've developed, and I just provided the link in the chat box, so it's out there.
Thank you.
And this is Adam. I'm sending in the link for that EDF report that Al mentioned.
Okay, appreciate the resources. All right, shall we move to addressing legacy infrastructure?
I guess one last comment that just popped into my head is that, I did mention earlier about ESG and how the rating agencies are getting geared up. There's lots of them competing on who gets to rate all these companies, but there's nothing better than a little competitiveness amongst the companies. I know that the first thing we have to do with flaring and venting is to get everybody to measure it. I know at Pioneer, it took us a while to get good data. And once you have good data, you start to see how big the problem is. So, and then you can actually start to set targets, reductions by X% per year. But again, back to, you know, what's the best data source that we could use potentially in Louisiana to compare these companies? You know, is it GRI or is it, you know, something else associated with some of these groups, Sustainalytics or others who are rating the companies on their own? They're pulling the data.
And just,
Glenn, do you have
Stacey,
anything more too? Because Glenn, you might know what Exxon's reporting in, and I know ConocoPhillips is reporting. They're one of the highlighted companies.
and GRI is a contractor that.
There's the Global Reporting Initiative.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And I would add from the, at least definitely for the midstream piece, the Energy Infrastructure Council released a common reporting framework earlier this year.
Good point.
All right, if there are no other comments, although this has been very productive and I think good conversation, we can certainly go back if anybody has any additional ideas. But to move the conversation forward, addressing legacy infrastructure, how might we do that? And Andy, I see your hand is raised, so we'll kick it off with you.
Yeah, and can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I'll try and be succinct, but I was hoping to maybe go first to try and frame the discussion a tiny bit, because as was mentioned a little bit earlier, we've got a couple different possibilities here, and I think they need to be looked at separately. And one thing about the low-hanging fruit of federal dollars and the potential for all this money coming to the state is that it seems like the sort of thing that we can all really get behind, the industry and the environmental groups and government. And I really think that this is a wonderful opportunity to redirect federal funds, probably via the EPA's state revolving funds, to the state of Louisiana. And we just need to make sure that our state's lobbyists in DC and and our representatives in DC are urging that Louisiana get as much as possible. And I understand there can sometimes be a moral hazard aspect if you are, because you have companies that are already bound by law to plug their wells, and if you are using federal funds to plug their wells, then that can be a problem. But I'm totally fine with using and getting as many federal dollars as possible to Louisiana to help address the problem. That's one side of the aspect, but another side of the aspect is that the problem is actually getting worse every day. And every month I look at what is issued in the state register, and you see far more wells being added to the orphan well list than are being plugged. And it highlights a problem that it's not just a static problem that we need to plug all these wells, because every month the number of orphan wells are getting larger. And of course, the orphan wells are only the beginning of the tip of the iceberg, because there are far more wells that are sort of zombie and abandoned wells that have actually not been plugged, that are hidden in the future utility status. And so I think that, setting aside the federal dollar aspect, I think the second aspect is that, and this may be a tough sell to the group, but I just want to put it out there because it's worth discussing, is that I think that we need to look at closing all of the many loopholes that exist that allow unplugged abandoned wells to fester, and to allow them to stick around on future utility sites, and that allow financial security rules to be skirted, and to put some meaningful financial security, and we need to remove the cap on the OSR fund. There's so many different things that can be done, both via the legislature and via the governor's office, that I think that it's worth looking at the whole panoply of reforms, that some of which may be awkward to the oil and gas industry, but some of which I think that they can get behind, and publicly they have. I know Don Briggs has come out and said, yeah, we need to double the fee that goes to plugging wells for the OSR fund. And so I think that having that as a second thing to talk about, aside from the federal dollars, is meaningful, and what reforms maybe this group can get behind. And I understand if not everybody's going to get behind all of them, but there are plenty of loopholes that can be closed in both law, regulation, and policy to help address the problem.
Andy, this is Jason. I appreciate those comments very much, and I think that the opening of this, Brent and I were talking about, I mean, a recent legislative hearing that Secretary Harris was in, you hit the nail on the head. They talked about the funding being grossly inadequate. There's obviously more wells than we know what to do with in terms of funding. So bringing emphasis and awareness to that issue, I think is a very big deal for Louisiana. It's something that obviously we're tracking, and the funding needs to increase because the need is so significant. And I think that Brent has some further thoughts on in terms of how vast those numbers are, just to kind of give some context to the discussion.
Yeah, Andy, I mean, he had some good comments that, we're orphaning a lot more wells than we're plugging. I mean, it used to be we hung around the 25 to 3,000 mark for the number of orphan wells. Now we're up to 4,500. So just given the average statewide, if it took 31,000 to plug each well and clean up the sites, and that's, taking into account deep wells, shallow wells and all, 31,000, you're talking like over $100 million, $130 million. So we would look forward to the stimulus money. And 6 or 8 months ago, they were talking about maybe getting as much as $25 million, $5 million a year for 5 years to plug wells. I mean, that would greatly help the program, because that's what we need, is a big infusion of money where we can make a big impact. Right now, we currently, just say from the production fees that the operators pay, we get $8 or $9 million a year for that. That can go a long way in North Louisiana, but if you're focusing on emergencies or high priority wells in South Louisiana, that doesn't go very far at all. We've had emergencies in the last few years, unfortunately. Plugging one well may cost anywhere from $1 million to $4 million, because we had to get well control people involved with it. So you could spend a lot of money real quick on just a few wells. So yes, we were really looking for some big infusions of cash, any way possible to help us out in those areas.
And Brent, isn't it safe to say that basically if you get those dollars, or you get a more of a larger lump sum, the efficiencies and the costs of being able to do multiple wells and multiple sites, obviously there's cost savings, as opposed to just having a small infusion of money where you can only just do spot wells at a time.
That's correct. And I think that would encourage other people to get involved, other contractors. What the problem is now, we have one contract that's won 3 bid awards. And so you're held up, in other words, because we don't have multiple contractors. We're held up for long periods of time. And like, you might get a contract this year to plug these wells. He's not going to be able to get to it till next fiscal year, because he already has 3 contracts and, with 40 or 50 or 60 wells to plug. So that's another problem with a big infusion of money, more work. You'll get more competitive bids, and then you'll have more people bidding on that, which is a big problem. And then also we need to increase the size of the staff, for the increased workload, so we can, handle that. But anyway, that's about all I have on that.
Thank you, Jason and Brent. Great points, and thanks for contextualizing the issue. Any reactions to either of their comments or to Andy's thoughts?
So this is Adam, and I would say that these thoughts are all in the right direction. There's clear importance to dealing with both the current problem and the inevitable future problem, especially as we move towards carbon neutrality by 2050. Clearly, this is not going to get any easier to solve. So for the current problem, the level of ambition I've been hearing for the bills that are under discussion is in the $4 to $5 billion range nationwide. So the amount going to Louisiana proportionally could be quite a bit, which would be very welcome. So that's one bit of good news, and there could be I wouldn't be surprised if there were bills released on this in the next month. Which would work out in timing for coming up with action plans by the end of April. And on the policy reform piece, at least one of the bills that I've seen has extra incentive dollars for states that pursue policy reform to reduce future orphan well burden. And so there's an added bump for LDNR to undertake revisions to all of these interconnected issues: financial assurance, industry-funded plugging, idle wells, well transfer, and the like.
Thank you, Adam. And do you, just to drill down a little further, do you have any specific ideas on what reforms would look like to reduce the likelihood of future orphan wells or abandoned wells?
Sure. Well, I could go on forever, and I don't want to, but one particular policy that both Arkansas and North Dakota have adopted is for transfer of low flow wells, that such wells get full cost bonding. To limit, basically the idea is to try to limit blanket bonding, which is the concept that's most subject to abuse, to wells in good standing that are making money and could potentially pay for their own plugging. But for the wells that certainly cannot, especially the ones that have been already transferred down the value chain, those states have imposed single well bonds. And North Dakota additionally has limited the number of inactive wells that can appear on a blanket bond. So things like that.
All right, thank you for elaborating. Any other hot thoughts on legacy infrastructure? So we have been hitting the orphan well issue and dormant wells. And I think it was you, Christy, who mentioned other legacy infrastructure. Just want to make sure that was captured, and we have a moment to think about any opportunities for those additional pieces of infrastructure or category.
I mean, I think as you have it captured here, I think it does, because, there's going to be some more studying and prioritization of what gets abandoned first and what that abandonment looks like. I think as the process exists today, we're all recognizing DNR is a little short-staffed and there's just a lot of legacy abandoned wells to address. So I feel good with how this is worded right now.
Okay, great.
I guess I'd like to ask Jason and Brent to move a well off of the idle list and get somebody to plug it. Is that a matter of regulatory review, or is that they something just gets to the end of the bond period or whatever? If there's more resources that need to be funneled to DNR to get idle wells off the books, I think that's a low-hanging fruit also.
Rules were amended, I guess, back in 2015 when we're talking about inactive wells, because really our rules don't define how long a well can be inactive, or in a future utility case. If it's not future utility, the reg is pretty specific. But if it has future utility, there was no timeline. So finally, at the end of the day, with the rules that were put in place, we have an inactive well assessment. So it's $250 a year for every inactive well that you have over 5 years old. So basically, we give them a 5-year grace period from the time they're shut in, 5 years out, and then they either have to plug the well or pay the $250 inactive well fee. And of course, for your bigger operators, TPIC, Hillcorp, You know, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars for inactive wells, but also, you know, we encourage them to put wells on schedule of abandonment. So, you know, you do have a plugging scheme, and then we're big on that now, that we're trying to push people to that, to where we can get wells plugged. But that fee's kind of helped in some ways. Our plugging of inactive wells has increased, but it probably, we could tweak the regs a little bit more to make it a little bit more proactive, I guess, and put more of a burden on them to plug more wells. So it would take some rule changes and that type of things.
All right, thanks for clarifying, Brent. Moving forward, and you know, we can always move back if anybody has any additional comments. So reducing leaks, was that pretty well covered with, you know, monitoring methane? I mean, you just want to make sure that there's nothing else, you know, in design or, you know, hygiene of equipment. If not, you know, just want to make sure we pause and have an opportunity to voice any additional things that might be outside of the monitoring and quantification.
So this is Adam. I know there's some opportunities in liquids unloading and pneumatic valves and thief hatches and some things along those lines, kind of running to the edge of what I know about those, but I do know that those are all you know, frequent avenues for methane leakage, and so that's sort of a half response. And then another thought is, we haven't talked about downstream methane emissions, but the natural gas distribution network is often a source of large emissions as well, and there are kind of similar leak detection and repair, and, you know, using advanced leak detection to prioritize pipeline replacement and things along those lines. Is that out of the scope of this committee? And if so, what committee does that belong to?
Thank you, Adam. Great points, and important to flag, even if you're not the one to hunt it down. So thank you for that. But we can move to, so the one that I think we need to rework how we're framing this, and maybe it is the carbon intensity of product, or perhaps thinking about how to rephrase the strategically managed demand and transition, but just thinking through what some of the other comments were on how do we position Louisiana production to kind of be the most resilient production in you know, of all the, you know, world production.
Harry, what about carbon management and reduction of carbon intensity of products?
I think that's great. Thank you. Brilliant. Any thoughts on that? Or, you know, anyone have ideas on how to, any specific policies or programs that can get us there, you know, to transition to carbon, you know, full carbon management, or alternatively, or in addition, reducing the carbon intensity of products?
Hey, Harry, it's Glenn. So, you know, it's the cheapest, lowest cost, most efficient way to manage carbon demand is through some sort of pricing of carbon. And that's been noticeably absent from the conversation so far. So I think it's very important. The state needs to seriously give that some consideration. Not only does it like put a price signal out there for, you know, consumption of carbon and therefore incentivize reducing your consumption of carbon, but I also think that carbon pricing greatly simplifies everything. It's a much simpler approach to trying to manage the greenhouse gas emission problem. That said, I think it's also very important to, again, something I said earlier about the fact that this is a global marketplace, and Louisiana has kind of a unique problem, or if it's not unique, it's one of just a few states that have this issue, that most of the emissions are coming from industry that is producing good products that are consumed outside the state of Louisiana. And so anything that's done here has to strongly consider, how do you do all the necessary border adjustments so that you aren't, not only unnecessarily harming the Louisiana economy, but also effectively, as we talked about earlier too, just outsourcing those greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. In which case, we haven't won, we haven't benefited.
So Glenn, are you talking about a carbon tax or a cap and trade system? Or when you say carbon pricing, what are you thinking is the most effective?
Some form of creating a price signal for the cost of carbon for the marketplace.
Because I think you make a great point that, the emissions are coming from large plants, a lot of them located in Louisiana, and the products travel up, Colonial Pipeline, and the emissions from transport vehicles come all along that pipeline, mostly up into the New York area or the Northeast. So so somehow not having the burden all fall on Louisiana, but spread sounds like it almost has to be federal. Again, we all share one atmosphere, which is the basis of what we've been talking about.
Thanks, Stacey. So recognizing the need for carbon pricing, but trying to avoid the leakage to other sources and not negatively impact Louisiana's economy, trying to set an even playing field across really the global market, and that may be best achieved at the national level or or through international agreements potentially.
Well, there's a lot of controversy behind, carbon cap and trade, as everybody's aware, or carbon taxes, but sometimes people think it is the best first step. So I think that needs to be looked into carefully.
Harry, I think this is very similar to, if you look at emissions reductions in terms of long-term strategies, there are countries that have very aggressive climate goals for their energy that's produced within borders. But then also, if the energy is imported from others, it doesn't count against their climate goals. So I think that, trying to manage this from a standpoint where we're not putting Louisiana at a disadvantage, where products and services can be viewed the same, not only in Louisiana, but in other states, or there's some type of offset that's done if they're sold or where that end product, ends up. I think that's where the challenge is. But again, I don't think that we can do that just with this committee. That's something that's a much bigger picture-driven issue that we have to look at, just with other states and with other partners, just because, at the end of the day, our products are sold all over the world. But I think that we can be good stewards, but that endpoint is very, very difficult to manage. So I think that, we need to pay attention to that. But I think that focusing on how we can create products that are either positioning us for being able to put those in a marketplace for a higher price, where you're driving economies of scale to others, where the carbon intensity is reduced, and that there's an actual policy that we're marketing, or another location that we're marketing for those products, like the steel example that I mentioned earlier. If that starts to happen, then we can very much position Louisiana in a state to say, okay, we're producing these products, they're X carbon intensity. When they're sold, this is what's transferred. So I think that's where, to get into that discussion, we need to obviously consider it, but we also have to look at how do we not put ourselves at a disadvantage with others as well.
And I think some of this comes back to the measurement side of it. And we talked earlier about net zero, and I've listened to many a webcast on what is net zero. And at some point, we probably need to come to a common definition, but often starts with measuring your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Obviously, those are probably what we're generating here in Louisiana, but then scope 3, which is also more difficult to measure. But if net zero is looking at all 3 of those, then it's becomes very national immediately. So, and if others have thoughts, if you've been successful at coming up with good definitions on net zero or understanding scope 1, 2, and 3, I think most companies right now are struggling just to measure scope 1 and 2.
But thank you, excuse me, thank you, Stacy. Excellent points, and certainly, more work needs to be done on and is currently ongoing on inventorying the state's greenhouse gases and really trying to understand the full carbon cycle in more detail, and not just inventorying emissions, which is what we're primarily focusing on in this latest cut of an update to the greenhouse gas inventory for the state. Just want to make sure.
Harry, are we doing all scope 1, 2, and 3, or does everybody know what scope 1, 2, and 3 is?
So if you want to dive in and educate the public.
Well, I'm not, I'll give it a try. I'll do a starting point. Scope 1 and 2 are the emissions generated by actually running your business and the associated utilities and infrastructure required to run your business. When you go to scope 3, it's actually going downstream and figuring out the emissions associated with the products and the uses of those products, not necessarily by you, but by your customers.
Thank you. Yeah,
it's a short starting point.
I think that was a good, short, sweet overview. And the task force itself had a nice discussion on this. I think earlier this year, end of last year, and no decision was made, but kind of recognizing the need to think comprehensively, right, and understand that we as Louisiana can't just operate in a bubble. And we consider scope 3, but to what extent are we actually able to measure and let alone act upon an impact, and also recognizing the notion of kind of double counting efforts that are being undertaken wherever the product is ultimately consumed. And so just kind of, I think we had a nice discussion identifying some of the issues and importance of kind of taking it into consideration, but maybe not holding ourselves to a hard, calculation on that component at least. But I think that there's more discussion to be had at the task force level.
Well, you have the old saying of if you can't define net zero, then any path will get you there. So
right, very good point. All right. Any comments? I don't know if Adam and Al, if y'all are looking to speak, but either one.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say.
Please.
But I'm going to lower my hand first. This is going to be controversial, but I'll just throw it out there. A lot of the when I go to meetings about lower carbon products, net zero products, we eventually get to procurement standards. So if one way Louisiana could help jumpstart the market in Louisiana for products that are net zero within the state, made within the state, is to have state procurement standards for those products. So I don't know whether that's a good or bad thing, but a lot of people believe that. As far as the greenhouse gas accounting, I will say it's complicated. I think everybody knows that, but one of the traps that I personally fall into is trying to reconcile corporate accounting with economy-wide accounting. They're two very different things. And what is Oxy's scope 3 emissions maybe another company's scope 1 or 2 emissions, depending on whether they utilize those products or they change those products to sell. So it's really hard once you get outside of corporate-wide greenhouse gas emissions and what net zero means. We Occidental tried to give a pretty broad view of what our plans are and our pathway to net zero report, which came out in November. And we touch on the, what we touch on our ambition, which is corporate-wide net zero. And our approach utilizes a lot of technology. It's technology driven, mainly CCUS. But I think it's important to note too that every company is going to do this differently. And all paths that lead to net zero, if we all agree what net zero is, are valid and important. So I think that was a good way of saying it. Last thing is, most of the reporting we do is under the global greenhouse gas reporting protocols that are developed by WRI, and I think the World's or the Council of Sustainable Business. I forget what the full title of that organization is. And this year, WRI and the other group are developing greenhouse gas reporting protocol for offsets and for CCUS. So that will complete a big missing piece of this puzzle. And Oxy is very involved in that. And any companies that either want to do things like buy offsets or maybe utilize technology and reaching your net zero should probably pay attention to the way this is going to be done too. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Al. Can you clarify, you say pyramid standards?
Reporting, did I say pyramid standards? Reporting standards.
Okay. Sorry.
And I'm sorry, procurement standards.
Procurement.
When the state puts out a contract for a highway and they need, so many yards of concrete, then, or steel. I know Nucor uses a technology that can be low carbon. Anyway, procurement. Sorry, my southern accent was holding me back again today. So there you go.
Oh, you were talking about drawing on the ancient, pyramid methodologies.
Where I'm from, pyramids are that usually has a scheme behind it, and you hang up the telephone. So anyway, talking about procurement, state procurement standards.
Yes, great point. They can play a very important role, certainly. Okay, I do want to make sure we're kind of try to let out on time, and this has been a really productive, healthy discussion. So let's kind of scroll through. I think some of our, I do want to know, I know carbon capture, use and storage is top of mind for a lot of y'all. It has been discussed to great length at the other committees, but primarily manufacturing industry, as well as I think to some degree the power production and use. And so I want to, I welcome thoughts and ideas on, but I recognize that this is a much bigger conversation, and to some degree, I just want to make sure I capture who's interested in developing further ideas, and actions and policies on carbon capture. But first, I'll just open it up to ideas on specifically how to foster or increase the deployment or development of technology for carbon capture usage and storage. And I don't know if Jason, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So Harry, I'll give just a minute overview of where, which is very difficult because I could probably give an hour overview of where DNR is, but carbon capture, utilization, and storage is something that we recognized was going to play a critical role in achieving net zero. Obviously, it is a significant tool in the toolbox, Our main focus areas over the last 2.5 years have been predominantly on the regulatory piece for this, on staff training, and on positioning Louisiana to make sure that our laws and regulations are ready for deployment. So that's a very broad brush in terms of what we've been doing, but that focuses on things like the regulatory pathway for primary enforcement action for Class 6 sequestration, which is something that our staff in the Conservation Department are working on to really work very closely with EPA, to where if someone comes to us with a carbon sequestration project, which we've already had one that has gone through that permitting process, that within about a year, when we're anticipating getting primary enforcement, that direction would be led by the state. In other words, we'd be working hand in hand with EPA, where there'd be a lot of input from the state of Louisiana. So the other piece is making sure that, like I mentioned, staff training and the overall making sure that the staff at EPA, as Adam mentioned earlier, and at the state levels are supported, that have an uptick in projects. If you look across the United States, we work very closely with the Carbon Capture Coalition. Not every state in the United States is positioned like Louisiana to do geological sequestration of carbon dioxide. There are a couple of key states that have very, very significant resources, and resources meaning saline reservoirs that are not drinking water, that are there for significant storage potential for CO2, both onshore and off. So our focus is trying to implement that program in a safe, effective manner. We have a committee called the Ad Hoc Committee that Blake Canfield, our executive counsel, is running to address a lot of those issues that Adam brought up earlier. And I think that our main focus is making sure that the public, that the companies who want to do projects are really have a very clear understanding of where the state stands on this. And obviously, we're always open to input, but I did want to just tee it off that, that the DNR is obviously tracking this very closely, and we're working with our federal partners, both on the delegation side and on the federal government side, to make sure that we're ready and that we have an effective program when projects do come across our door.
Thank you, Jason. That was an impressive 1 minute overview of where the state is, and recognizing we're tight on time. I'd like to, if folks can hold their comments on the pros or cons, or potential co-benefits or potential harms of carbon capture, and really just focus, like Jason did, on specific actions. What policies would you need to implement to effectuate the implementation of carbon capture storage, or delineate the different ways of implementing, creating a regulatory framework, staff training, for example, that are examples that Jason provided. So anything on that level of the policy or programmatic level.
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments on that, Harry.
Okay, please.
One is, I mean, so certainly the regulatory structure is critical. So I was glad to hear that spoken to already. And then the other aspect is, the realities of carbon capture and sequestration is it's very expensive, which doesn't give you many kind of levers to play with. I mean, one is the state can out and out assist the funding of it. It can provide tax credits. It could fund R&D, or back to the earlier point about carbon pricing, it could provide that price signal to industry that helps it decide how valuable is carbon capture and sequestration to my particular business.
Thank you, Glenn. Great point. Appreciate you being succinct, and I think you laid out some good specifics right there. Any other thoughts? And I do want to, I think at this stage, I know there are some, oh, go ahead. Does somebody have something that they'd like to raise?
Yeah, I would just throw in community engagement as sort of a broad category. And then so I heard from my colleague, Scott Anderson, who's on the Manufacturing and Industry Committee, that they have like 7 work groups on CCS. So how to best harmonize between committees so that we're not repeating each other's work?
Right. Well, great point. And I think that leads us into assignments of these ideas. And so, yeah, if we could run to the top. I know we didn't get to every strategy to populate. So if you have, are going to circulate this list shortly after we clean it up after this meeting, and just let us know if you are interested in working on or developing either independently or at least just coordinating with others who are looking at the same issue. So we can just put y'all in touch and make sure that y'all reach out and coordinate amongst yourselves. Starting from the top, leak detection and repair programs. Who wants to take the lead on kind of putting together, or just to commit to developing an action proposal related to leak detection and repair programs?
This is Adam. I'll volunteer for this one.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Anyone else that cares to at least just coordinate efforts with Adam?
Brent?
I'll participate in that too.
Brent
Campbell. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, and if y'all change your minds or realize you're interested in developing this, or know somebody that is, because these action templates are being developed by committee members, but also members of the task force, advisory group members, and members of the public. And so we're just trying to make sure we're coordinated, that the most obvious ideas that were identified by this group are developed into action proposals, but there's no certainly there are others that, and we just want to make sure we're all coordinated in that development. So I guess we'll move, kind of stick with the themes, kind of reducing who's interested in developing action proposals related to, reducing flaring and venting.
Brent Campbell.
Okay, thank you, Brent.
And this is Adam. I'll work on this one too.
Okay. Well, Brent and Adam carrying a lot of the work, but it's going to require everybody.
I can be a resource to both this one and Eldar. I just don't have the time to coordinate overall.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate it. And so Brent and Adam can reach out.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, here's Al Collins. I'm happy to help out too. But most of what I would refer to is in that EDF report I mentioned, which Oxy, was participating in developing. So I'll leave that to Brent and Adam to decide if that would be helpful or not.
Appreciate it. And I do know Andy was interested in developing ideas on, or perhaps we haven't gotten there, sorry. Moving to the legacy infrastructure component, Andy Jacoby is interested, certainly. Any others interested in working up and developing proposals?
Like inactive wells and all that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, Brent, you're there as well?
Yeah, we just talked, yeah.
And this is Adam. I'm afraid put me on this one too.
All right. Well, folks who haven't yet, who haven't yet volunteered themselves, I hope you have one lower down on the list, because we certainly want to encourage everybody to submit at least one, just to demonstrate and put their
Harry, are you
expertise
looking for people to take the lead on each, or are you asking for people to participate on each, or both?
Participation would be helpful at this stage, just so we don't have to identify those folks later, if you can, and if you can distinguish whether you're interested in just participating, like Stacy had mentioned, or if you're interested in taking the lead. Now is a good opportunity to voice your interest and then make that distinction.
Okay, I'm interested in participating in the legacy infrastructure, just not in the lead
thank
at
you.
this time.
Fair enough.
And I would be in the same boat.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes.
And Harry, this is Mark Jebbia. I'll participate in the Eldar, both for upstream and midstream.
Okay, great. So Mark on please make sure Mark is noted on the top one on leak detection and measurement. Okay, and Don Caffrey is interested in participating on the legacy infrastructure issue. All right, and I know, Adam, you mentioned the reducing leaks, the kind of the downstream natural gas distribution leaks, looking at policies that would target those leaks. And perhaps it's just passing this along to, I know you mentioned you may know some others that are perhaps more knowledgeable about that issue.
Well, so in fact, the thing that others might be more knowledgeable about is pneumatic pumps, liquids unloading,
gotcha.
leaf hatches, and things like that. That's part of upstream. On this downstream thing, I have put out a word to a colleague of mine at EDF, Natalie Karras, who runs our downstream leak reduction program. And if she bites, then I'm happy to work with her to create a template on this issue. If she doesn't, then I'm going to be out of bandwidth to do it myself.
Fair enough. All right, well, thank you for that. All right, and then moving to the strategically, I think how do we read? Carbon management and reduction of carbon intensity of products. Who's interested in supporting or taking a lead on developing an action proposal?
Harry, I'll definitely participate on that one.
All right, thank you, Jason.
And you can put my name down for that one or the CCS one. I would say put me wherever you need the most.
Appreciate it, Glenn. All right, and let us know if you see any sub bullets that you're interested in working on specifically or developing. I'm trying to move quickly to get everybody out on time. And Glenn, you mentioned also for carbon capture and storage. Anyone else? I know Jason, this is certainly your wheelhouse, and anyone else that would be interested in coordinating their efforts.
Hey, Harry, this is Lori LeBlanc. I would just offer me and or Nathan. So
yeah.
basically will help on this. I know we've been actively involved in this space. So representing Lamoga, I'm happy to.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And really, yeah, this is to help coordinate and also bring in additional expertise and folks to help you work. We'd certainly encourage people to bring in other folks who aren't on the committee to work on and develop these actions. So certainly don't feel like you need to have all the answers.
I'll be in that arena also, and I can probably coordinate with some of the science committee people since I know some of them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Hughes. All right.
And this is Adam. Throw me down on this one too.
Appreciate it. Okay, and did we develop any additional actions after CCS? I don't believe we did. We will circulate this draft, and please just let us know if you have additional actions that you'd like to populate under the specific strategies, and we'll manage coordination amongst folks who express interest, and to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks and ideas are developed.
Yeah, Harry, just real quick, I just wanted to ask a quick question for Colleen. Are y'all able to capture the resources and the links that are being provided in the chat for future reference? Those we've had some really good ones that have come across, and unfortunately I hadn't been able to grab every one of them. So if we could possibly just cut and paste those, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Oh, definitely. I'm going to save the chat towards the end or before we adjourn. Okay, excellent. And with that, Colleen, unless you think we need to, I think we're good. And am I mistaken, or are we now going into public comment?
Harry, I'll walk through just a few of the next steps for you guys real quick.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we'll move right into public comment. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for such a wonderful discussion around moving some of these actions and strategies forward. So Harry and I will follow up with you all on cleaning that up some and tasking out the action development to you all. But also looking ahead in this action phase, I just wanted to bring to your awareness the April all hands cross-sector review workshops. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we're looking to design some working sessions for collaboration across committees and advisory groups so that you all are able to refine and enhance the action ideas that you're developing through that cross-disciplinary lens. So we're considering having about 6 different working sessions, similar to the one that you all had today. Just being able to brainstorm where there are common or alternative approaches or actions that need to be worked on by multiple groups, that you could have an hour or 2 hours to organize around those different themes. And so we'll assign every member of all of our groups to one of these working sessions, but they'll all be scheduled consecutively, so they'll be recorded, and you can watch other sessions as well. But on this, I just wanted to frame the question of which actions or themes you all think it would be most helpful to have a deeper focus on. In these workshops that we do, I know there was a lot of discussion around CCUS and possibly discussing with the manufacturing group. Also, the power group as well would be a great partner for you all. But if there are any initial ideas from the chairs or from any of you members, that would be helpful to us. Maybe just to think on for a minute or two, and you're always welcome to follow up with us after.
Yeah, I would maybe ask folks to just email Lindsay their thoughts after, just to keep us on time.
Yeah, in the spirit of time. So with that, I would just remind you of submitting the action proposals using the template to our climate email, and also sending that to your committee chairs so that we can stay aware of what's being submitted when. We also have the online Google form and the submission through mail to our Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. So with that, we will move into public comment. If there's anyone who's on the meeting, on the webinar from the attendee list who has a comment, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, and I'll promote you to a panelist to speak. And Harry and I will also check the climate email to see if we've gotten any email comments. And I don't see any comments on our email, nor do I see any attendees who have raised a hand. Possibly we can wait one more minute just to see if anyone has questions. I don't see any hands raised or comments through our email, so I'll hand it back over to the chairs to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Harry. And I just really want to reiterate thank you to all the committee members. I really meant what I said earlier, that you know, when you put the meeting structure together, and Goka's done a tremendous job just with these frameworks, but you never know how the discussions are going to go until you get in the room. And I think that we did a pretty good job of vetting a lot of these very complicated topics, and really have made headway. And I think when we start to talk about these big picture issues, these are the types of things that when we can start to develop and work forward, this is what's going to make the difference. And I think that, you know, again, this group is very critical in terms of moving a lot of these things forward. And I really appreciate all the discussion. I think that we probably at some point we'll be able to get together, and I'm looking forward to that. But I mean, until then, I really, my thoughts are just that I'm excited about where we're heading. I think that today was just kind of a focal point to say, okay, now, yeah, we've talked about things in general, but how can we actually achieve those goals? So I think that train has started, and I think the momentum based on the schedule in terms of what we have in terms of homework is going to obviously carry forward. And again, I appreciate all of you taking the time to really do the homework ahead of time. And then now's the time for the rubber to hit the road for us to really start to make some headway. So Brent, anything to close?
No,
all right.
good.
So appreciate it. Thank you so much for all the time. And again, for all the folks who helped to make these meetings happen. And again, I hope everybody's week continues to go well, and you stay safe, and be careful out with the weather. I know we're supposed to get some nasty one tomorrow. So take care. Talk to y'all soon.
Thanks for facilitating the meeting. Great job.
Thank you.